Hello, hello. So, welcome to this discussion lecture about the presidency and how it relates to the rest of the executive branch. I have some notes I wanted to go over, somewhat based on the textbook, but also somewhat based on, some of the questions that are being put to you in your essay. Questions that concern the presidency are the following. So, are there two different ideal types or archetypes, the way that Democrats and Republicans organize their White Houses? Describe those differences. And what's the relationship between the executive office of the president and the cabinet? What's the difference between them? And how can they relate to each other directly? Give some examples. So in addition to that, there's a couple of other points I want to talk about. The Vice President and the First Lady for one. But also a few other points that you might find interesting that you might be able to add to your essay, perhaps. Talking about signing statements and different models of how the executive office is organized, but then also what are some of the ways that historically presidents have staffed their White Houses, and how has that affected the rest of the executive branch, and what kind of size are we talking about here? So first of all, to get an idea, let's talk about that first. Cabinet is 15 people. It's 15 departments, and they are in the line of succession to the president. I'm sure you've all seen. If you haven't seen Designated Survivor, I don't know, where have you been? No, it's a show based on this idea of, you have to have someone wait out the State of the Union and important speeches that everyone attends, so that in case everyone dies who's attending the president's speech, there is still a continuity of government. And in this TV show, Designated Survivor, the Secretary of Housing is the one who stays, in his sweatshirt eating pizza in the basement of the White House during the State of the Union address in the Capitol, and he's actually about to lose his job the next day, something like that. But he becomes the president because there's an attack on the Capitol. So, Hollywood has tried to make hay of presidential succession for quite a while now, so that's not new. But this is one way that, we kind of engage with our politics, right? Is how tenuous is their hold on power? And there are these 15 cabinet departments, but there's also, in addition to those 15, there's another, I believe, 7 that are cabinet level appointments that don't have to be confirmed by the Senate, but that are at cabinet level rank within the government. So they come to cabinet meetings, which is a pretty low bar, but they come to cabinet meetings. But in addition to that, they have the ear of the president, they have responsibility over policy, they have a budget. So cabinet level is another meaning. So that's the Environmental Protection Agency, the Director of National Drug Control Policy, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget. And a lot of these are actually in the executive office of the president too. So just because they're cabinet level doesn't mean they can't also be in the executive office of the president. The Environmental Protection Agency is actually within a cabinet department, the Department of the Interior. But they're seen as kind of different jobs. I think eventually a president is going to, or Congress will split those agencies, but for now they're the same agency. There are 1,200 appointments that have to be confirmed by the Senate every 4 years. There are 8,000 political jobs that can be reappointed every 4 years, so only 1,200 of them or so are Senate confirmable. The rest are just whoever the president is can appoint whoever they want to fill that job for the next few years. But there are a little under 3 million civilian employees of the federal government. So most of those people have, or at least I hope most of those people, it seems like most of those people would have civil service protection for their jobs. And that's something we can talk more about in class if you want. But in the executive branch, there's been a history of different political patronage systems, starting with, of course, the Federalists kind of believed in an aristocracy of education, and so the most qualified people were appointed. Jefferson sought to, make the White House more common. He would often answer the door, whereas that's not something Washington or Adams would ever think to do. But it was still early days, anyway, of the administration, and Jefferson's successors kind of they brought back a little bit more of the formality, to the point where the Jackson administration was seen as kind of rude and uncouth compared to previous administrations, and that's where the instance of the spoils system came into legend and reality. So the spoils system, of course, the quote, if you haven't heard it, to the victor go the spoils, meaning that a president can, and I think to paraphrase Jackson, I believe he said at one point, if there's not a job in the federal government that a Democrat can't do, if there's a job in the federal government that a Democrat can't do, then I don't want to know about it, or something. So I've not seen it yet, I think is what it is. So Jackson felt like he could appoint whomever he wished, and didn't have to really worry about education or expertise. And so political parties began in earnest during the Jackson era, because it allowed political parties to reward their supporters with jobs. And so it incentivized them to incentivize people who wanted those federal jobs to support these candidates for federal office, and to both fund and give of their time and energy to elect people to office. So both the Democratic and Republican parties began to be electoral machines in this way, and at the city level, they really became machines, because they took that model and they put it into reality and into systems within urban political environments as well. But that whole 19th century, of course, in the middle of all that, the Civil War, there's a good book called Yankee Leviathan by Richard Franklin Bensell at Cornell, and he argues, and as do most people who have studied it, that the Civil War was essentially fought by the Republican Party in the North and won, and they remade the federal government in doing so. So I wouldn't say the Civil War was an exception to the rule. If anything, they accelerated this idea of the spoils system. But about 20 years after the beginning of the Civil War, there was a tragic circumstance that caused the public to really rethink their acceptance of this idea of the spoils system in the federal government. And that was the assassination of James Garfield. Excuse me a second, I'm just going to make sure that I'm still recording. I hope I am. Yes. So James Garfield of Ohio is assassinated, lingers for several months, and dies. And it's by a jilted office seeker, job seeker. And this is a scandal that grips the nation, especially even while Garfield is dying. And his successor, Arthur, who is this political patronage boss, ends up being the one who has to really sign into law this the end of the political patronage spoils system as he knows it, called the Civil Service Reform Act. So he's able to sign that into law, and he's never reelected in his own right. Um, but this signals the beginning of civil service protection. And those of us in Sacramento, where I live, this area, know that civil service is the bread and butter of the California state government. That a lot of people in the Sacramento area are somehow connected to civil service jobs at the state. And if you don't have one yourself, you probably know someone in your family or your extended group of friends who does have some kind of state position that most likely is covered by civil service protection. So it's this idea that you have essentially property rights to your job. You can't be fired without cause. So you're not as vulnerable as people in the rest of the economy. So this originated with this Civil Service Reform Act in the federal government back then. It wasn't until Franklin D. Roosevelt, though, that you started to see those political party jobs sort of brought back in the form of rewarding people who were part of those old political machines who wanted back into the federal government, but they also brought along labor unions at the time and academics. So that began a kind of transformation of the Democratic Party again, and it wasn't until you saw Reagan really try to not only bring back some of the spoils system explicitly, but also get rid of civil service protections through breaking labor unions over labor collective bargaining negotiations. The air traffic controllers had a negotiating standoff with Reagan in 1981, so he just fired them. And so that was a heavily symbolic move in terms of organized labor, but it also made a direct difference in the federal. Where was I? Oh, yes. So, sorry, it looks like my camera is overheating. We'll try to finish this up. Just move on to the fact that, so now we sort of have a hybrid model of civil service protection and not in political appointees. And so it creates a pretty wide universe of employment there in the executive branch. So let me just draw the distinction that, if I haven't made clear yet, is necessary. So the cabinet versus the executive office of the president. The cabinet is the more traditional, appointments that you're used to hearing about. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, all of those offices are simply appointments made by every new president, and sometimes people last all 4 years, but in the middle of a term too, once they're appointed, they have to get the constitutionally required advice and consent of the Senate in order to take office. And there are exceptions to this. Sometimes presidents will make recess appointments, which are this kind of weird technicality. It just allows people to hold office for about 2 years until the next recess. But it's mostly today. It's still your standard issue appointments and confirmations, especially among that 1,200 that I mentioned jobs. But the cabinet level appointments, including, for example, the new kind of UN climate envoy and the UN ambassador, is a cabinet level appointment, kind of right below the Secretary of State, but is not Secretary of State. So that's the cabinet level, and the executive office, though, is maybe the more intriguing one that's got a lot of attention in the last few years. The executive office of the president has about 500 total employees, but it's kind of the people around the president, but there are various offices within it. The biggest office within it is the Office of Management and Budget, and they help set budget policy numbers and also manage White House personnel and within that office, and they also are they kind of help set the direction. There's also of the administration, and there's also the Chief of Staff. The Chief of Staff is the person who the president usually sees the most on any given day. They're kind of a funnel of activity. There is a hierarchical model, and there is a more, sometimes what's called spokes of a wheel model, sometimes it's called a collegial model. The hierarchical model of organizing the White House versus the collegial model or competitive model also are very simple, really. There was no position of Chief of Staff, and there wasn't really an organized White House staff of any kind. There were certainly White House staff, but it didn't have a formal structure until maybe the Roosevelt administration, the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And at that point, it became necessary to start doing a lot more heavy coordination because the federal government was growing, and the power of the presidency was growing. The U.S. was growing in power, so it became necessary to create, more positions to be able to meet this need. And the Chief of Staff was not, readily appointed. It was something that was kind of an Eisenhower innovation, actually. And he brought the governor of New Hampshire on, Sherman Adams, who really was very good at administering the White House and also having good relationships with Capitol Hill, with Congress. He was brought down by scandal, but nothing that today would be laughable. It was not really a scandal. So getting a coat for his wife or something like that. But Republican presidents like Nixon were fine with kind of delegating a lot of authority to a chief of staff. It sounded a lot like a military office, and allowed them to kind of take on more of the kind of public salesperson role of the administration, where the chief of staff could do all the necessary deal making and really political work, as well as administrative work. So the chief of staff became sort of the power behind the throne, if you will. But the Democrats tended to be more, I would have to say, of the half dozen or so that we're talking about, Kennedy, even Johnson, but also Carter and Clinton, also really, all of them really thought of themselves as more kind of academic, young intellectual types, and they preferred a more open and collegial environment. And they all tried various forms of either not having a chief of staff or not having an all-powerful chief of staff, one that doesn't necessarily make decisions or is just another voice in the room, is not the kind of voice of the president. But they all ended up, really, for the most part, all of them in their later parts of their presidency ultimately ended up canning that model in favor of the more Republican-oriented chief of staff model. And Obama never even pretended. He just had a chief of staff right away that was very much in charge of his agenda, Rahm Emanuel, who later became mayor of Chicago, and was able to pass, I guess, his healthcare legislation. But the chief of staff is a very important position, and one thing that's interesting is that it's been studied a lot in presidential studies quarterly in the journal that we'll be talking about more. But it's a position that has a lot of interesting features, a lot of interesting backgrounds of the office holders. So frequently, what's been going on is that the Office of Management and Budget, the director of that office, which again is the largest office within the executive office, ends up getting appointed somehow to chief of staff, either in the second term or in the later part of the first term. And so it's the kind of chief manager within that. So who gets appointed to this budget position? often people who are kind of financially or economically oriented or who have a business background. And these are the people who, again, see the president most often. So there is a case to be made that the chief of staff, I think a pretty persuasive one, that the chief of staff position has become the way, or one way, in which really the business sector, the industrial sector, whatever you want to call it, within the U.S. is able to quite literally have the ear of the president on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis. And so, is that something that we need to reckon with or not? So, besides that, there's quite a bit in your chapter that I would turn your attention to, in addition to the kind of competitive versus hierarchical model of organizing the Chief of Staff office in particular and the White House staff more generally. There's also a fair bit about the daily briefing book and memos and speeches and report to Congress that have to be made on a regular basis that I would urge you to take a look at, because they all involve administrative tasks by people who have various levels of access to the president. And the example of Nixon is one that kind of pervades all of this study about the executive branch, because he, really attempted to he was the first president maybe to turn the White House into his own kind of personal political operation. His first one in quite a while anyway. And he had been the vice president, so he really knew his way around the presidency. So that brings me to, the two different models of seeing the vice president. One of them is as a rival, and the other one is as the potential successor. The rival idea really comes all the way back from Thomas Jefferson being John Adams' vice president, and after the establishment of presidential tickets and really political parties, that shouldn't have been possible anymore. However, John C. Calhoun got to be vice president under two presidents who didn't like him, Adams and Jackson, and they didn't like him and he didn't like them. But Calhoun wasn't very likable. He was really a proponent of slavery and as a positive good, and he was in favor of secession of South Carolina and other states from the Union if they didn't get their way. Besides those examples, more contemporary ones probably are Henry Wallace, who was the leader of... Henry Wallace was the leader of a pretty radical progressive faction against the Roosevelt administration while he was vice president, and caused Roosevelt to ultimately dump him from the ticket in 1944. Later on, though, vice presidents, especially Dick Cheney, Al Gore, and most recently Joe Biden, and perhaps Mike Pence, but not really Mike Pence, were really very active within the administrations. They are not the rival, they're seen as the potential successor. And so there are these two models that you ultimately need to reconcile. And by the way, the traditional and kind of the traditional first lady role is one of supporting the president and typically choosing one issue to speak out about that doesn't really contradict the administration. But there is another activist role that has been assumed definitely by Hillary Clinton during the Bill Clinton administration. And then before that, Eleanor Roosevelt was really her model, I think, because Eleanor Roosevelt helped found the United Nations, and even after continued to do that, even after Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945. So those are the two kind of models of First Lady hood, and basically these are some of the central issues that we talk about when we talk about the White House. So I would say that we should talk more about these in perhaps class. because now you have 4 videos from me about a relatively short number of topics. And for that, I apologize, and so we'll see what we can do to get those cleaned up and in the future avoid this issue. Thanks for watching.